Professor of Political Science and Integrated Liberal Studies here at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm also the director of the Center for the Study of Liberal Democracy, which is a think tank here on campus that sponsors events like this one. This event is the 6th installment of a lecture series that we created this semester for a class called Conservative Political Thought. Professor Walsh is doing double duty for us this week. Over the past 5 or 6 weeks, we've read and discussed some writings from Edmund Burke, the French counter-revolutionaries, from some women from the American Revolution, from Alexis de Tocqueville, and last week we turned our attention to two 20th century American conservatives, Russell Kirk and Robert Nisbet. In the coming weeks, we'll have scholars come talk to us about Michael Oakeshott, that's next week, about what a conservative disposition brings to constitutional interpretation, to localism, to identity politics, and then we will wrap the semester up with Patrick Deneen talking to us about conservatism and populism. The specifics of all this can be found on our website, which is csld.wisc.edu. And on that, if you navigate to the page for this lecture series, you'll find links to some of the readings that correspond with the particular speakers that we have coming in. And today we have a very special guest, Dr. David Walsh. Dr. Walsh is professor of politics at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. His teaching and research interests focus on this question: does our civilization possess the moral and spiritual resources to survive? In response to this question, Dr. Walsh has traced the modern retrieval of order in a trilogy of works. First, in which I earlier told him was the very first book of political philosophy I bought as a second-year undergraduate, a book called After Ideology, Recovering the Spiritual Foundations of Freedom. In that book, Dr. Walsh asked whether the catharsis evoked by the totalitarian crisis of the 20th century called forth an affirmation of truth beyond the abyss of those horrors of the wars. Second, in The Growth of the Liberal Soul, Dr. Walsh suggested the emergence of a minimal order within the abbreviations that became the liberal democratic form. Finally, in The Modern Philosophical Revolution, The Luminosity of Existence, with uncharacteristic optimism, Dr. Walsh reflects on the overarching philosophical horizon of modernity, which he sees as a refounding of the classical and Christian understanding rather than a radical departure from it. And out of these reflections, Dr. Walsh has sparked a renewed interest in the centrality of the person from whom order radiates into social and political existence. The first phase of this new philosophical direction appeared in his book, Politics of the Person as the Politics of Being, which is a really great book, I recommend it, followed by a companion volume, The Priority of the Person, from just a few years ago. And he's currently at work on a book called The Invisible Source of Authority, God in a Secular Age. I am deeply grateful to present a thinker who has long been a source of visible authority for me. Please join me in welcoming to Madison, Dr. David Walsh.
Wonderful, thanks, Rick. I have to make sure I'm turned on. Thank you very much, Rick, for the kind introduction. Thank you for the very warm invitation to come here and talk today. I'd like to express my gratitude to the center and to Rick and to also Cecilia Klingele and to everybody else who's been a part of the organization here. It's great also to see Eduardo Schmidt-Passos, who worked with me at Catholic University, and to see Father Eric and everybody from the St. Paul Center, and everybody who came to the seminar this afternoon. So, you know, this is a real treat for me. People think that I get to talk about these things all the time, but I don't. And so it's wonderful to see so many of you come out this evening to have a little bit of a session together on Catholic social teaching, and especially on the encyclicals, which I do teach because I have a course called Modern Christian Political Thought, but I only devote about 3 or 4 weeks at the end of the semester to Catholic social teaching because I have to cover a much longer period of time. Catholic social teaching only, as you know, in the modern period, really only gets going with Rerum Novarum. I want to say a few things about that. And so, you know, when Rick, this is not a lecture I've given before. When Rick asked me to give it, you know, I don't want to provide, you know, warmed over stuff that I've given somewhere else. So this is a fresh talk for you. One of my Irish friends says, well, you produce fresh chips every day. And that's what we aim at, you know, fresh food. Nothing warmed up, no leftovers, none of that, no. And that's what makes it fun to come, and I can rethink things that I'm somewhat familiar with, but discover with you something new in them. And I have never thought really about this connection between the person and Catholic social thought. It's like, you know, when you come to Washington, D.C., and get into a taxi, the only thing you can be sure is that you and the taxi driver will be seeing the city for the first time. At any rate, I thought, well, you know, this is not kind of a well-worn point of view, but I would want to, and one of the things that's inspired me was a book called Christian Human Rights that I'll cover in the talk itself. But what we will do is do a little bit of historical context first, and then we will go all the way up to Benedict XVI, and officially really Francis, who issues Lumen Fidei, the light of faith. I won't go beyond that. But I am open to questions, you know, and whatever questions you have at the end. Let me just advance these things. The best place to begin thinking about Catholic social thought is the French Revolution, because that's a kind of watershed event that has an impact on the church, especially in the 19th century. And from there, the church begins to take a particular kind of direction which marks it for another 100 years between the First Vatican Council and the Second Vatican Council. They're a little bit like World War I and World War II, but not quite the same, but you know, we number them in those kind of ways. The French Revolution is a watershed event because it's the first time when, you could say, the Enlightenment and Western civilization breaks out into open hostility against Christianity and the church. The rights of man are juxtaposed against the authority of the church. You know, if you think about what the Enlightenment was about and what culminates in a sort of historical way in the French Revolution, it is the assertion of human autonomy and independence, a kind of supremacy asserted by human reason against all other authority, sacred or divine, natural, supernatural, whatever. And there are, of course, other consequences that come from that. Out of the French Revolution comes the requirement on the clergy for a civil oath of loyalty to the state that takes precedence over the church. And the scene is set for 100 years of what the Germans call Kulturkampf, cultural struggle and opposition. What we would call value clashes today. And it's an unfriendly time for the church. And the church itself begins to take a stand on things as a result of that. Particularly with the papacy of Pius IX, and the First Vatican Council, which takes place in 1869 to 70. There's a series of condemnations that are issued. Condemnations of rationalism, socialism, even Americanism, and the assertion of human autonomy. All of those things are regarded as suspect because modernism, there's a whole string of them that come out, particularly at the council or around the time of the council, the syllabus of errors, everything that we might call a kind of fortress mentality within the church develops there. And that has some beneficial consequences, but also some negative consequences. It's also in the First Vatican Council that the decree on the infallibility of the Pope is issued. Not that people thought that the Pope was likely to make mistakes before on questions of doctrine or morals. Popes naturally can be wrong on lots of other things, advising on investments or on good taste, how to dress. Any of these things, popes are not very reliable guides. But in terms of doctrine and morals, yes, that is their job, and that's where they could be relied upon. So the question really was whether it was wise to declare the doctrine at that time, and that really is a kind of symptom of the atmosphere in the church, a circling of the wagons, and a kind of blunt assertion of pushback against a world that's increasingly hostile to the church. And this is also the period in which you could say the rise of secular messianic thinkers, Marx, Comte, positivism, nationalism, and all of those things begin to happen at the same time. So it's a wider thing. Now, if you look back a little bit and think about what the French Revolution was about, the assertion of the rights of man, that all human beings have a right to fundamental natural rights and the right of self-government, throwing off the vestige of feudalism, aristocracy, monarchy, all of those things. There's nothing inherently wrong with any of that. But it does come with a kind of expectation that this will go much further. The church, we might, when you step back a little bit from that point of, you could say, open hostility, and think a little bit more about it, you realize that, yes, taking a confrontational attitude towards that world was not the only option. And that indeed, there is also a sense in which an alternative approach would have been to explain to that world what its real deepest roots and inspiration are. To make each person sacrosanct individual center of the universe. To build human society around the dignity and worth of every single individual, which is really, for all of its bluster, what liberal democracy, even in its most militant form out of the French Revolution, is ultimately about. The American Revolution expressed, obviously, a much friendlier attitude towards religion, Christianity, and all of that. And you could see that on display was this other form, other face, you could say, of what liberal democracy is. But all of that was missed by in terms of the viewpoint from the Vatican. The viewpoint from the Vatican was heavily dominated by this French hostility, where the religion of reason, the religion of humanity is installed in Notre Dame, as opposed to the religion of Jesus Christ and the religion of the church. Okay, keep that in mind as the background, because I think we will return to it, that indeed that was not the only path to be followed. 1891, we have a different pope, Leo XIII. I must step back a little bit and say that this is a great opportunity for all of us to think about the succession of encyclicals that come from Leo XIII. And one of the things you notice about it is that Rerum Novarum, which is his most significant encyclical, is memorialized roughly on the anniversaries of 1891. So the next big one is 1931 with Pius XI, Quadragesimo Anno. But Leo's encyclical, Rerum Novarum, is an encyclical that deals with the current social crisis, that of labor, the clash between labor and capital. And he establishes what we might think of as the first principle of Catholic social teaching, the common good, that labor and capital need one another, and only in that way can they serve the common good. Avoiding the extremes, avoiding the abolition of private property, encouraging the formation of unions, but not necessarily open clashes, class conflict, or anything that went along those lines. So it's a very moderate in tone type of encyclical about the state of affairs in the modern world, dealing with the kind of ordinary reforms that were necessary in modern industrial society. You have the problem of economic downturns, the vulnerability of individuals within that, the vulnerability of workers within that. You have the abuses of employment, labor conditions, everything. All the things that come under the heading of reform of the working conditions. So that makes perfect sense. And yet it's not a kind of open warfare between owners, producers, and workers. And indeed aims at a kind of harmony in civil society. With this basic principle in mind of the common good. When people think about the encyclical tradition, that's one of the central tenets of it, the idea of the common good. The problem with the common good as the major anchor is that it doesn't really provide us a way of thinking about how individuals fit within that. That's fine in terms of thinking of being members of social classes, being parts of larger groups, but not in terms of how we measure, you could say, the value or the worth of individuals in relation to a whole. One of the fundamental, when you think about the formation of society, one of the questions you have to ask, and about the political profile that it has, one of the questions you have to ask is, are we all simply contributors to a common enterprise? Is that what the common good means? Or is each human being somehow the end or purpose of that enterprise? Leo XIII doesn't have an exact formulation for that, but I would suggest one that comes from a later political theorist called Michael Oakeshott, who distinguishes between two types of association that we can belong to. We can belong to what's called an enterprise association, where once you join, you submit yourself to the rules of the enterprise and to the authority of its leading figures. And you lose your liberty. You sign on and you follow orders. This is what it means when you join the military. It's what it means when you work for General Motors or for Google or for Amazon or for anybody. It doesn't exist to serve your good, your end primarily. You may benefit from employment within it, but the end is to serve the shareholders, the owners, and the enterprise itself, to defeat the enemy, make a profit, produce a product, everything. There's a different kind of association that we belong to, which is that what Michael Oakeshott calls a civil association. A civil association is where we belong to a community whose purpose is to allow us to fulfill our individual liberties. And the whole enterprise has no product, no goal beyond that of the members themselves. If you're driving around town on a nasty rainy day like today, you see everybody obeying the traffic signs, everything is working fine, and all of those rules are there to enable you to go about your business of going wherever you want to go. There's nothing in the traffic laws or in the traffic systems of a town like Madison that requires you to go anywhere. You don't even have to come here. It's there to make it possible for you to arrive without accidents, without crashing into one another, and to enable all of these individual parts to work utterly towards their own independent ends, as ends in themselves. So instead of having an end beyond that of the association, each individual is an end in him or herself. It's not that Leo is unaware of that or has none of that, but that this is a way of thinking of how different views of the common good can be explained. So the common good is in both of those forms. And I would suggest that the common good of persons ultimately is one that serves the good of persons. Human society has no end beyond the good of its members. It doesn't exist to conquer the world, to build empires, to increase the GDP, or to do any of those things. It exists only for the good of its members. A growing economy and an expanding GDP, those are all ancillary goods along the way, a means towards that end. They are not the ultimate end. The encyclical literature, when you look at them as we're doing this evening in a kind of integrated perspective, gives us a kind of long, slow motion kind of, or delayed photography kind of thing, where, by taking a snapshot at each time, you see how something develops over time. Well, within the church, it's like that too. There's nothing infallible about the church's pronouncements in the social teaching area, except in relation to the first principles, not in relation to the ways of serving those principles. And it's interesting to see in the next milestone anniversary, 1931, the next famous encyclical in this area is Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years later, literally, the 40th year. Pius XI is living at a different time. The world is different. The problems are different. It's not the problem of a clash between workers and capitalists. It's a problem about concentrations of economic power that lead indeed to massive economic downturns. So yes, the Great Depression, the various crises of the 1920s, late 1920s and 1930s, everything that feeds into what becomes the worst period of the 20th century, the rise of totalitarian states. And, as we think about that, there's no reason to expect that the church would have a better insight into the way in which history is going to unfold than anyone else. Reading the signs of the times is a matter of making prudential judgments based on the best available information, data, and so on. And no one has a superior insight into that. Empirical judgments are a matter of empirical observations. They're not a matter of revelation or of a supernatural point of view. So once you keep that in mind, the observations in Quadragesimo Anno are nevertheless surprisingly impressive. Probably, one of the things that strikes me anyway is that Pius XI declares that Rerum Novarum was the Magna Carta of the Church's intervention in the social sphere. Okay, there is a sort of triumphalist tone to that. That should alert us a little bit that there's a certain kind of insecurity about that question. What is social teaching in the church? It is an effort by the church to speak directly to the whole world. Literally, the encyclicals are circular letters to the bishops. I was kidding somebody earlier on today that we were in the class on the encyclicals and they were enjoying it, and I said, well, you are probably way ahead of the average bishop in terms of reading these texts because they are written at a certain level that every bishop in the world can read rapidly and communicate out to his priests and from there into the faithful. But beyond that, these are efforts for the church to establish a public role for itself. It's not just for the bishops. It's not just as a kind of word for the faithful. The church lacks in the modern world a public function, a public authority. John Courtney Murray, the great American theologian and observer of these things, published a book around 1960 called We Hold These Truths. And one of his big arguments in it is exactly this, that the church is interested not just in being the head of a voluntary society, where if you want to join, you can pursue your own individual salvation and so on, and make a contribution to things. It is that the church will play a role in shaping the civilization. If you think back to where the church was after the French Revolution, especially in Europe, not in America, but obviously America is a unique case because the Catholic Church was a minority church at any rate, and it was always a little on the defensive side. This is not a Catholic country, and you couldn't expect to be warmly received here. And hence we have Catholic school systems and all kinds of things like that. But that certainly does not rise to this level of complete hostility that the church experienced from the 19th century up into the 20th century, anti-clericalism of all types, all of that. So within that very unfriendly world, the church has to find a way of saying something that's morally significant and going to be of great benefit to this entire civilization. Not just for Catholics, but for all human beings of goodwill, all well-disposed human beings. And this is indeed what the encyclicals are staking out. And this is, in a sense, what Pius XI is sort of suggesting there, that this is a Magna Carta that sort of opens up this invitation for the church to step into the public square and to shape it, to make it its own, to be a player in it, an authority in it, as a center of moral authority. That's not an insignificant element, because from the point of view of modern states, the church has no role. Even where you have established churches or where the church has some sort of special relationship, usually it means that the state is in charge of defining that relationship, not the church. The medieval model is the model of a split between spiritual authority and temporal or political authority. All that's gone. So what you have then is the church as any other private association, pursuing its own interests, looking after its own members, and maybe making its own pronouncements, but having no relevance to the wider world, especially outside of the Catholic world. So this is a kind of ultimate purpose that lies behind this encyclical literature of social teachings. And Pius XI is an important figure within this, not only because he recognized it and said something about it, but because the way in which he thought about it was that, look, the church is finding its way between what he called individualism, by which he meant liberalism, and collectivism, by which he meant socialism or communism. And that the church would be able to be on the side of a third way, somewhere that's neither individual nor collective, but that combines the two. Now, what is that way? That was the $64,000 question. At this point, there's nothing in Quadragesimo Anno where the church can point to and say, this is the model, this is what we mean by it. The only model that he could think of was the model of the corporate state, where all parts of the state, all parts of society work together. In this, you could say, along the lines of the medieval guilds. So everybody involved in one kind of industry or system of production would be part of one comprehensive association. They're not trade unions, they're not professional associations, they are corporate associations, and the state itself is the sort of sum total of all of those. This is obviously the period, the 1930s is the period of the Great Depression, all of that tremendous economic upheaval, inflation, loss of employment, loss of wealth, all of those things that people eventually cannot stand and are willing to take on something else. The place where the term corporate state comes from is really fascism. So Mussolini was the first person to use the term corporate state. Now, the Pope wasn't obviously thinking of Mussolini, but he's sort of flowing in that direction. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not above invoking the model of the state as one corporation that all of the parts, all the elements fit together under a kind of overarching authority that from the center directs everything. However, there is one term that Pius XI introduces here, which sticks within the Catholic social teaching tradition, and that is the term subsidiarity, which he defines as not to withdraw from the individual to the community what individuals can accomplish through their own enterprise. That every activity is best performed when it is performed by the lowest level at which it can be freely performed, rather than centrally organized within the state. What we would regard as Tocqueville's principle of association, without invoking that. So that's, when you look back and think, what are the various principles that get enunciated within this tradition? Well, we've got the common good. Now we've got subsidiarity. And we keep going there. However, there's a little thing called the Second World War that intervenes. And the Second World War turns out to be a cataclysmic revelation of all of the evils that can be embedded in modern civilization, where up to 50 million people are killed, many of them by their own governments. And yes, the recovery from the Second World War goes far beyond any economic crisis or any social crisis or anything that we might think of as crisis of civilization. It is, you could say, a human crisis. And it leads to new international institutions, including the United Nations. 1945, the Charter of the United Nations talks about to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person. Where's the church? It turns out that the church is indeed accompanying that terrible world as it is recovering from this worst convulsion of the past century, which ends with the nuclear bomb, the atomic bomb, Oppenheimer, and all of those things that you've seen recently, the Holocaust, everything that, all of that terrible nightmare of the 20th century. Yes, in the midst of that, there are people thinking about the future. I put this book up by Samuel Moyn because I'm very taken by it, and it's one of the inspirations for the talk of the person as the key to Catholic social teaching. Samuel Moyn is not a Catholic. He's not a Christian. He's essentially a secular historian. He operates as a secular historian. He's Jewish, but he operates as a secular historian. And so he just simply calls the shots as they are and gives us, I think, a pretty decent account of where things stand. And the big argument of the book is that in this period, when Pius XII becomes the Pope, there isn't a kind of huge encyclical moment at the beginning of it all, but there are some green shoots that turn out to have huge implications. One of them is his Christmas message of 1942, the worst, lowest years of the Second World War, where Pius XII declares that the origin and the primary scope of social life is the conservation, development, and perfection of the human person. We're moving away from a kind of collective corporate model of human society, whether it's the common good, the enterprise association, or whatever it happens to be, and we're moving towards something which is not exactly individualist, which is, of course, also what they wanted to avoid, because individualism is selfishness. It's individuals pursuing their own good at the expense of others. It's egoism on a mass scale, and it's what has given liberalism a bad name. If you get our friend Patrick Deneen, Patrick will make this case to you as well, that everything from the French Revolution on was the rise of individualism and therefore of collective selfishness. And why liberalism failed was because it only cultivated the virtue. It cultivated only the virtues of individual self-interest at the expense of civic virtue, the common good, and everything else. What the church always understood as the proper way in which human society should develop. But in 1942, with Pius XII, a new term is introduced, the idea of the human person. So rather than thinking of individualism, we now begin to think in terms of persons. And why are persons such an important concept? Because the idea of the person is already an openness to other persons. St. Thomas, in talking about persons, says, the term person means relation. When I see you as a person, I'm aware of you and you are aware of me. We already have a bond, a connection. We don't have to be persuaded that we owe something to one another, that we're addressed by one another. We don't have to come together into some sort of major organization that's directed from the center or anything else. We simply have to recognize that we spontaneously and naturally form a community of persons. And that's a radical shift, because this allows the church to think of the institutions of liberal political society as not just individualist, but as personalist. And therefore to think of the language of individual rights as not just each individual looking out for themselves at the expense of others, but of, you could say, looking out for the rights of one another, a mutual caring and reverencing for the rights of one another. So all of a sudden, the church is on a very different trajectory. This doesn't go against the idea of the common good, doesn't go against the idea of subsidiarity. Both of those are still there, but now it's much more, you could say, integrated into a vision of persons as forming a community of persons, where the point of the community is not anything outside of it, but the well-being of its members themselves. And we get this remarkable shift. There's no longer a search for a third way between individualism and collectivism. Now the church begins to embrace the language of individual rights, liberal democracy, and the institutions that sustain liberal democracy, including representative government, the rule of law, and constitutionalism generally. So instead of looking for a kind of utopian model of some, you could say, corporate perfection, or some organic model that never existed, now we're moving towards the idea of a community of persons that underpins respect for the rights of each person and the dignity of the person as the center of our association together. The thinker who is at the heart of that is Jacques Maritain. 1939 to 45, he gave a series of lectures called The Person and the Common Good. And this is a series of lectures, you can Google it and get a PDF online, and Notre Dame have this book out that has all of it in it, in which Maritain lays out this case that persons alone in the universe are willed for their own sake. We're willed by God for our own sake, not because we play a part in relation to the whole universe, but because we have an end that's beyond the whole universe, to be one with God beyond the universe. By its liberty, the human person transcends the stars and all the world of nature. That's what it means to be a person. to be a being of radical transcendence. That's why persons are the origin and end of political society, properly speaking. No matter how it's worked out in terms of institutional factors, in terms of the way in which power is distributed, goods are divided, or anything else, it has to be done with an equal respect for persons. I have to tell you, I have to do this little digression, since I'm from Ireland. You may not have guessed, but I actually am. And it's a source of great pride to me that Samuel Moyne, in his book, points out that our Prime Minister, Eamon de Valera, in 1937, wrote a new constitution for Ireland. Long before Maritain started giving his lectures, before Pius XII started giving his Christmas message of encouragement and hope and everything else, and really laid out what is essentially a new personal dignity basis for constitutional rule. Of course, he hasn't been widely appreciated in Ireland for it, nor was any of that applauded within the wider church or anywhere else in the world. But, you know, we do, from time to time, I don't want to say appreciate losers, but appreciate the underappreciated. And Eamon de Valera certainly is in that category. Nowadays, of course, back in Ireland, we're doing everything we can to rub all of that out of our constitution through referenda. So, you know, if you follow Irish politics, you'll see we had a referendum last week where the government was trying to, you know, get rid of any reference to family or marriage or anything else in the Constitution. It was, of course, defeated by the wisdom of the Irish voters. So we're not entirely a bunch of idiots, and our superior elites can, of course, from time to time get a drubbing within an election. And within a referendum. You know, democracy is a dangerous thing. When people start voting, they make up their own minds. There was another occasion when we rejected the European Union altogether, called the Lisbon Treaty. And the European Union was very upset with us for doing that. And they were very upset because, you know, we were basically receiving subsidies from the European Union all through this time. Okay, we're getting subsidies, but, you know, we were legally entitled to them. You know, it wasn't like we were putting our hands into their pockets and taking it out, you know. But nevertheless, we didn't want to see the European Union getting too big for its britches. And the Irish voters, in all of their wisdom, decided they were going to reject the Lisbon Treaty. No other European country ever subjected their European agreements to a vote, all signed off by the government. But in Ireland, we have our constitution, and we the voters, got a crack at it. And to the great chagrin and inconvenience of European elites, we said, no, we don't want it. This was before Brexit, obviously, but it was a kind of pre-Brexit idea. Now everybody wants to, even the Brexiteers want to go back into Europe, and it makes perfect sense. All I'm doing is suggesting that this is a kind of splendid example of how democracy in action works. It's messy, it's untidy, and you know, this is part of the way in which Eamon de Valera had set it up. The most interesting part of this Constitution is the preamble, if you look that up, which begins, "In the name of the Most Holy Trinity, from whom and to whom, as our final end, all actions both of men and state must be referred, we, the people of Eire, seeking to promote the common good with due observance of prudence, justice, and charity, so that the dignity and freedom of the individual may be assured, do hereby adopt, enact, and give ourselves this Constitution. You could not get a better formulation of what a personalist constitution would look like. And certainly it's rooted in the deepest of a Catholic ethos. Not that it's warmly welcomed any longer, but Samuel Moyne in his book has this lovely observation. As the countries of Central and Eastern Europe abandoned their democratic constitutions to become totalitarian, it is, quote, therefore both crucial and mysterious that thanks to the Irish, constitutionalism founded on human dignity also came about in this world. That's a lovely quote, especially because it doesn't come from anybody with an Irish dog in the race. Okay, fast forward a little bit. I always thought that the social encyclicals were rooted in the centrality of the human person. And I always thought that Mater et Magistra by John the 23rd was one of the turning points in that. First place, he says, must constantly be accorded to individual men. Nothing is more precious. And in the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, the great pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world, they have almost the same formulation. Social order must constantly yield in its development to the good of the person. That's a kind of mid-century phase of the whole thing. Again, fast forward a little bit, John Paul, his pontificate, where does he get the name John Paul from? He takes it from the two popes who together initiate the Second Vatican Council and initiate this major shift, including also other things in relation to geopolitics and others, which I won't go into. And of course, he had this long pontificate. But he gets his name, obviously, from John and Paul. Why is he not called John Paul I then? Well, because the previous pope was John Paul I, and he only lasted a month. And when the cardinals came to elect a new pope, they decided they'd better not go for anybody who's close to 80 or around that, you know. Even they have to vote rationally under the influence of the Holy Spirit. Here's my favorite slide, though. This is from an Italian artist called Maurizio Catalan, 1999. It's just such a beautiful picture. I decided to put it in. This is the Pope being crushed by a meteor. I bet you never thought of that. You know? You know, some things are just looking at for their own sake, you know. Art is in advance of everything else, you know. You can't really think ahead of an artist. Again, on the centenary, Centesimus Annus, 100 years later, 1991, from Rerum Novarum, John Paul II issues his encyclical, where he says, he doesn't say that it gave the church the Magna Carta or anything, these things. He says it gave the church citizenship status, which is a much more modest way of phrasing it. The key was the dignity of the worker and of work. Principles of friendship, solidarity, civilization of love, and preferential option for the poor. There you have all of the elements that now coalesce in Catholic social teaching. The common good, subsidiarity, the dignity of the human person, and solidarity. Subsidiarity, solidarity, dignity, and what was the other one? Preferential option for the poor, yeah. John Paul, though, is an inherently interesting figure, though, because he had such a long time, and since we're talking about the idea of the person, I want to suggest that you might also look not just at the encyclicals, but at some of his poetry. He was a first-rate poet and a playwright and an actor of superb ability. So he was an amazing figure. And one of his last big poetic efforts is the thing called the Roman Triptych, which came out around 2003, when he was pretty elderly. And I'll read you just a few lines from that. It's a long meditation on human existence, where he says, "The rushing stream cannot wonder as it descends, and the woods silently slope, following its rhythm, but man can wonder. The threshold which the world crosses in him is the threshold of wonder." That's what defines the person. The capacity that the person has to look back and wonder and ask, how is it with you? How are things with you? To think about the other and put oneself in place of the other. The knight who discovers the Holy Grail is the one who comes across the wounded guardian and asks that important question, how is it with you? How is your suffering? How is your affliction? That's the question of wonder that really defines the person. Jumping ahead a little bit, I'll spend the last few slides on Benedict XVI, and that's where Benedict is a great successor to John Paul. John Paul is a sort of philosophical personalist. Benedict is a theological personalist. So I think we were blessed with these two enormously profound popes who lead us into this deepening of the Catholic social teaching tradition. And one of the sort of strange moments in advance of that is a famous conversation between the future Benedict, Joseph Ratzinger, and Jürgen Habermas. Jürgen Habermas is a kind of classic contemporary Enlightenment intellectual, a rationalist, a secularist, and everything else. But he and Ratzinger have this profound conversation in 2007, which was published called "The Dialectic of the Dialectic of Secularization," and in it, Ratzinger concedes that we are now entering a different historical phase where we're no longer living in a secular world, but instead we live in a post-secular world. This is a world in which secularism has reached its limits and is now, you could say, ready to receive that voice of divine authority and divine inspiration that the church can provide in its moment of affliction, moment of struggle. So we're coming into this very different historical phase where it's no longer, you could say, the militant secularism that's on display in the French Revolution and its aftermath has receded. Not that, there's been a profound change. We still live in secular societies, but there's by no means a kind of absolute acceptance that secular self-understanding defines our self-understanding completely. Habermas is a great concession to that. He has another little meditation called "An Awareness of What is Missing," if you want to look up any of those things. Benedict XVI, 2005 to 13, and died just a couple of years ago, issues a series of encyclicals that really are a kind of culmination of the whole tradition, and especially if you think that tradition is tilted enormously towards the heightening of the centrality of the person as I happen to think it is. Earlier, he had written a book called Introduction to Christianity, which is not really an introduction. It's quite a tough book to read. And he has this lovely formulation in it that's worth quoting, where he says, "Therein lies concealed a revolution," talking about Christianity, as a revolution in man's view of the world. "The sole dominion of thinking in terms of substance is ended. Relation is discovered as an equally primordial mode of reality." The relation of persons. Relation is the primordial mode of reality of persons. His first encyclical in 2005 is Deus Caritas Est, God is Love, and this becomes a kind of foundation on which he has three other encyclicals on each of the theological virtues: faith, hope, and love. In different, not in that order, but beginning with hope, love, Caritas in Veritate, and then the last one is Lumen Fide, the light of faith. He says, "Love, Caritas, will always prove necessary even in the most just society." That's a huge and important reminder that even though the encyclical tradition is focused on questions of social justice and fairness, justice is never enough. And human society is never going to be satisfied merely with justice. And if you look around at the contentiousness of our own society, that's a big part of the problem, that we've been focused too much on justice and not enough on caritas, charity towards one another. "I must be personally present in the gift." So it's not enough for the state to deliver our gift to those in need. We must be personally part of that. Hope is, and this is from the next encyclical, Spe Salvi, 2007. And obviously he's, he produced a heck of an amount within the short time that he had. When you think about the Jesus of Nazareth volumes, these four encyclicals, and the many other political addresses that he follows up with. Hope is the eschatological dimension in which our lives are lived. What's the difference between thinking about the future in terms of optimism or thinking of it in terms of hope? Hope is something more than optimism. Hope is what's already been arrived at. Faith is not merely a personal reaching out towards things to come that are still totally absent. It gives us something. We're already at the end. That's what he means by an eschatological dimension. The judgment of God is hope, both because it is justice. Justice cannot be eliminated, cannot be avoided, and because it is grace. We cannot simply be limited to questions of justice. Hopefully, God's mercy is more than that. It is in that eschatological event that the contradictions of existence are resolved. I'm just sort of summarizing his argument. The unrequited demand for justice is requited in divine love. There's obviously a much more profound theological tone introduced here into the encyclicals. And you ask, well, what's happened to all that stuff about subsidiarity, the common good, or the mutual interest of capital and labor, avoiding concentrations of power, the development of people, progress, and all of those other things. It's not that they're absent, but they have receded. From time to time, earlier encyclicals would talk about the need for more world government or something, but none of that matters in terms of Benedict's encyclicals so much as clarifying what the Christian message is that's most deeply needed and desired by a world that now sees itself as no longer as secular, no longer as militantly opposed to the supernatural. these are just a couple of other quotes from that encyclical that are, just to give you a little flavor of how intense a meditation these encyclicals are. They're at a totally other level in terms of what they open up, in terms of our understanding of ourselves and how we stand in relation to the mystery of existence. It is never too late to touch the heart of another, nor is it ever in vain. Hope carries us forward in ways that we have not yet fully plumbed or measured or anticipated. Even death is not an impermeable barrier. The belief that love can reach into the afterlife. Caritas in Veritate returns a little bit to questions of economics and to other things, but now no longer with, you could say, a heavy emphasis on more policy orientations or practical implications. Instead, it's much more about the inner and deeper change that economics itself requires. The full development of the person as self-transcendence, as a sharer in the divine life of persons, structures all talk of the benefit of civilizations. And this is the quote that I'd like to give you. He says, that is why, quote, in commercial relationships, the principle of gratuitousness, of self-giving, and the logic of gift as an expression of fraternity can and must find their place within normal economic activity. Why is that important? Well, we've left far behind any notion of individual self-interest. That's what's involved. We think of economic transactions as transactions in which the two parties come together because they each are seeking to advance their private property, their private profit, and their private self-interest. And that's what companies are all about. That's what economic activity is all about. And Benedict's reminder is no, over and above whatever economic benefits are derived, there is a human benefit that exceeds all of it and that is properly measured, not in terms of the bottom line, not in terms of return on investment or anything else, but in terms of a deepening, ongoing relationship. Even when I go into Walmart, I'm greeted by someone who says, welcome to Walmart and have a nice day. There is no benefit to any of those expressions that I get in Walmart, but it does add something to what's a purely transactional relationship that, you know, is worthwhile in and in itself. It's a little reminder that, no, you're not just a customer, and I'm not just the employee who serves you now. Cashiers, before they, were reduced to swiping credit cards, used to be taught, and when they're returning change to a customer, to touch the customer. These are not things in encyclicals. These are just things that we discover by living, by finding out. When you touch somebody, you've made a change in the relationship. Even though it's a very superficial relationship, you realize, yes, we've become connected in a way that we couldn't even express, but it's there, nevertheless. There's something over and above whatever is transacted that says, yes, we are persons together. And of course, that's the meaning of economic activity at the best level. This is also in Caritas in Veritate. We are stewards of the goods of the earth, and quote, when human ecology is respected within society, environmental ecology also benefits. So all of it comes together in that. It is in relation to one another that we are. The Christian revelation of the unity of the human race presupposes a metaphysical interpretation of the humanum, of the human nature, of all that constitutes humanity, in which relationality is an essential element. The standard definition of the person was that the person is the substance of a rational nature. I do take exception to that because I think that that's an inadequate definition of the person. It suggests that the person exists to maintain itself in being, for that its own survival, its own existence, its struggle for survival is at the center of things. But relationality is different. Persons are capable of giving themselves for one another and of giving themselves away. What kind of a being is it that doesn't seek to survive, that wants to generously pour itself? Only persons are part of that reality. The last encyclical is Lumen Fidei, and I will just say a couple of words about it. This was not, this comes out under Pope Francis, but it was 90% written by Benedict, and I'll skip over this one. But basically, Francis, when he became Pope, it wasn't that he walked into the Pope's office and discovered, oh, he's left something behind. This was an encyclical that he was going to issue, but Francis adds a little bit to it, and Francis is a kind of living witness to the centrality of the person. He's not a thinker on the same scale as John Paul II and Benedict XVI, but he is in a sort of deep harmony with the idea that the witness of the person, including his own person, is the defining witness that he can give. But the encyclical is really mostly written, almost entirely written by Benedict, and the arguments you can see come from him about truth being prior to ourselves and all of that. It is a question about the origin of all that is. The question of truth is a question about the origin of all that is, in whose light we can glimpse the goal and thus the meaning of our common path. This is probably the one to end with. There's one more, I think, after this. He said, this is from Lumen Fidei, Benedict again. We have to think of it as really Benedict's encyclical, where you could say the problem that is sort of set up in the French Revolution of bringing together the individual and the whole, autonomy and community, the autonomy of each member, the free independence of each member, and the tension between that and the community that comes together is overcome in the idea of the person. We tend to think that a unity of this sort between freedom and community or authority, freedom and authority, of this sort is incompatible with freedom of thought and personal autonomy. Yet the experience of love shows us that a common vision is possible, for through love we learn to see reality through the eyes of others, as something that does not impoverish but enriches our vision. Through the free giving of ourselves, we find our personal fulfillment. It's not selfishness, it's not self-interest, it's not individualism. It is that moment in which we relate to one another at the deepest level and find ourselves in one another in the service. Through faith, we glimpse the meaning of the begetting of children, a sign of the Creator who entrusts us with the mystery of a new person, which is about as profound a mystery of the person as you can think of that when when a man and a woman come together and form a child, it is a procreation, a cooperation with God in the emergence of a new person that is not reducible simply to the biological actions involved. Even Aristotle calls our attention to this incomprehensible reality that when two biological animals come together to form a third, how can that offspring be rational? Aristotle is thinking of it in personalist terms. Where do persons come from? They can only come from God. And to be a person is therefore to be a participant in the kind of life that only God can provide. Thank you very much. Yeah, by all means.
And I would like to ask you to use the microphone. We are recording, and please ask questions.
So you define a person as having an inherently relational quality.
Yeah.
So how is a well-intentioned person supposed to productively interact with somebody who is unable to or refuses to extend personhood to them in turn?
You can't make anybody be your friend. That's true. So if someone does not want to enter into a relationship with you, you can't compel them. The relationship has to be free and consensual in every sense. All you can do is hope and extend the hand of friendship and of love. That's all. Yes, rejection is part of the suffering of being a person. And no one is more rejected than God. Always have to keep that in mind. The suffering of rejection is a divine suffering too, not just ours. Thank you. It's a great.
I just had a quick question about, so there's like a rise, I guess, across the world of like post-liberal thought and just this idea of like liberal societies collapsing.
Yeah.
Where does, I guess, the Catholic social teaching really fit into like, if we are entering into like a post-liberal world?
Great question. Thank you for it. I don't really, the best of this tradition is you could say epistemologically modest. It's modest about its own expertise. It's modest about its own capacity to judge the state of affairs. And it's modest, and it's painfully aware of its own failures. So you should always start with that admission. I wouldn't accept much in the way of financial advice or corporate advice from the church. If you look at Vatican finances, they're not the most splendid of witnesses. How the church has dealt with political crises is not always the best either. There are many shortcomings in the way in which the church itself operates, and you could say that it is in no better position to judge than those who do their best to study the reality of things and be as well informed about it as you possibly can be. You are the church. The laity is the church, and the laity participates in the shaping of Catholic social teaching as much as any other, as much as the clergy. So, it's our responsibility to ask that question of ourselves. Where are we going if there is such a thing as a post-liberal age? Like, all I can do is offer you my own sense of it, that post-liberal, I think, still will be a kind of liberal age. Because we're not going to dispense with the idea that each human being is entitled to full reverence and respect for their dignity and rights. Nor will we dispense with the idea that government, by the rule of law, with periodic elections, with more than one political party, and with a view towards the common good, is not by any measure preferable to alternatives, especially not preferable to rule by experts. Yep.
I'm wondering how you would recommend Catholics today who are looking at the political landscape kind of strike a balance between almost like a defeatism and pulling away from and wanting to just focus on family and community and the immediate people around you, and also still having to be involved in some way in politics of, like, still standing up for moral injustices and,
right,
and fighting things that are obviously evil, but yet not being overcome with political mudslinging and thinking every single day about politics and election cycles and things like that.
A great question. The main thing is, do not abandon politics. Do not abandon the public sphere. Do not leave it to the worst forces that are out there. Do not leave it to chance and the randomness of, say, technological developments that drive people insane. You can say the social media operations that really have a truly negative effect in human society. You push back, you look for resistance and so on. And you think in terms of two things. One is, what can be done practically? And what can you do to improve the social atmosphere? Every single person carries that burden of making the world a better and kinder place by treating other people not as your enemies, even those who are your with whom you have political differences and disagreements. These are not your enemies. These are your fellow citizens and friends. Never forget that. Not only because it's true, but because that's what the harmony of any society is based on. The harmony that the network of mutuality that individuals have built up between them. What creates civil society and makes it vibrant is that people trust one another. They trust one another because they sense that mutual respect and, you could say, confidence and love, even, that exists between them, affection. All of that are important. Now, the one